Hello, I'm Kegan Chandler, and welcome to Exploring Religion. Today, I'm very excited to talk to you about a brand new book I have coming out later this year on monotheism in Japan, or more specifically, monotheism in Japan's new religious movements. Now, if you're at all familiar with the study of Japanese religions, you might already be thinking, monotheism in Japan? There's no such thing as a Japanese monotheism. But if monotheism and Japan sound like a contradiction in terms to you, then stay tuned. You'll definitely want to hear what this book's all about. The book is titled Monotheism in the New Religious Movements of Japan: Historical and Taxonomical Challenges in Western Studies. And it is now currently forthcoming from Routledge and will be appearing in their Studies in Religion series. And it's scheduled to ship after the 4th of July this year. Very excited, very honored to be working with Routledge and their team. And I want to go ahead and say how fantastic the editorial group has been to work with. It's been a great process so far. Now, this book represents a new argument for the presence of monotheism in Japan's new religious movements, and also in Japanese religions in general. And at the same time, the book aims to challenge standard assumptions about the category of monotheism and about the cross-cultural study of religions more broadly. And to expand on all of that, on the screen here, I'm going to give you the official book description, at least as it stands right now prior to publication. I think this will help set the stage before we talk about the book in more detail. It says this book calls for a reformation of the image of monotheism in studies of Japanese religions and in the study of religions in general. According to most scholars, Japan and monotheism mix like oil and water. Whatever Japanese religion is, we are told, the Western category of monotheism cannot be imposed. The predominance of this standard ruling makes critical the study of Japan's new religious movements, or NRMs, exemplified in this volume by Kurozumikyō, Tenrikyō, and Konkōkyō, which have occasionally and controversially been pinned with the monotheism label. However, significant disagreement and confusion have persisted for nearly a century in Western scholarship over precisely how to classify these religions, and furthermore over where their monotheism, if it exists, might have come from. Chandler argues that this long history of dissonance in the West is the result of a complex layering of taxonomical, sociocultural, and scholarly issues. Furthermore, he suggests this impasse can be addressed via an updated definition of monotheism that takes into account its nuances and includes new monotheistic subcategories. The book reveals the monotheism of Japan's NRMs in light of this new framework and through a new historical investigation into Japanese sources of monotheism. It is especially relevant to scholars with an interest in Japanese religions and new religious movements, as well as the comparative study of religion and philosophy of religion. Okay, so hopefully that sounds interesting to you, if not a bit controversial. And if it doesn't sound controversial to you, then congratulations, you've yet to be baptized in the fires of religious studies debates about comparative categories. And that's okay. That's probably better for your health. And I'm only half joking. But really, despite all the effort and the challenge that it was to do this project, it's really been a wonderful journey doing the research. And I hope this work inspires conversations both in the field of religious studies and beyond about both the situation of monotheism in Japan and about the categories that we use or choose not to use to describe religions. And ultimately, I'm looking forward to a conversation about what all of this might indicate for the future of cross-cultural exchange. Now, I thought it might be interesting and helpful before I go any further into the content of the book to introduce what I mean by new religious movements of Japan, and also to introduce very briefly the three Japanese NRMs that the book is focused on, just so you can get a feel for the historical and theological atmosphere of these subjects. The category new religious movements corresponds to the Japanese term Shinshukyo, or new religions, or to Shinko Shukyo, newly arisen religions. And these are terms which scholars in Japan have used since World War II to describe a wave of religious phenomena which were developing in the early to mid 19th century and beyond, Prior to this, some of these early groups had, rightly or wrongly, been categorized as sects or denominations of Shinto. In the 1880s, the Japanese government had included 13 of these groups in sect Shinto or Kyoha Shinto, a category which was created to distinguish these emerging movements from what we call state Shinto. Now, some of these groups would eventually break away from this category of Kyoha Shinto, arguing that they were never really part of Shinto at all. But that's another story entirely. But three of these early Japanese NRMs, which were at one point included in Kyoha Shinto, this is what my book focuses on. And while there are many, many more NRMs than this, I focus in the book on these three for a few reasons, namely historical reasons, which will hopefully become a little bit more clear as we go on, and certainly clearer as you read the book. But the three that I focus on are Kurozumikyō, Tenrikyō, and Konkōkyō. And I'll give you just a few lines about each of them here. Kurozumikyō was founded in 1814 and formalized in 1846 by the Shinto priest Kurozumi Munetada, who lived from 1780 to 1850. Kurozumi had founded this movement after receiving healing and then a revelation from the great goddess Amaterasu in 1814, who had revealed herself to be the supreme deity of the universe, and said that she wished to save humanity through Kurozumi as a teacher and as a living kami. The second NRM, Tenrikyō, is perhaps one of the most well-known of Japan's NRMs. Its foundress, Nakayama Miki, who lived from 1798 to 1887, she was born to a farming family and originally was raised within Pure Land Buddhism, Jodoshu. However, Nakayama would not remain a Buddhist. Somewhat similar to the story of Kurozumi, Nakayama experienced a divine revelation in 1837 when a deity possessed her and revealed itself to her as a god called Tenryō no Mikoto, which might be translated as Lord of Heavenly Wisdom or Divine Wisdom, who is also called God the Parent or Oyagami. This great parental deity revealed to her that it was the creator of the universe and that it was the creator of humanity and that it wanted to save the world by possessing her body as its shrine and by making her the mediator between itself and humanity. The last movement is Konkōkyō. This was a movement founded in 1859 by the farmer Kawate Bunjiro, who lived from 1814 to 1883. Kawate said that he believed he had dishonored a deity and as a result was stricken with illness until the deity instructed him to devote his life to teaching humanity. Eventually, Kawate came to understand that this deity was Tenshi Kani no Kami, or the golden kami of the heavens and earth. And this was, in fact, the creator of the universe. And Kawate understood that this deity had taken over his body, again, very similar to the story of Tenrikyō. And from this point, Kawate Bunjiro, acting as this deity's vehicle, began to teach others to worship this great kami. So hopefully that was helpful and enough to interest you in these subjects. They're all three very interesting and similar in some ways, as I imagine you can already tell from their historical descriptions, and yet also extremely distinct in terms of their beliefs and their practices. And but we'll get into all that shortly. Now, in terms of what led me to write this book, this work is actually based on my doctoral dissertation that I did in the Department for the Study of Religions at the University of Cape Town. So it might be helpful for you to understand a little bit about the journey which led to doing this dissertation. Prior to my PhD, my research and publications in the history of religion had focused largely on the development and transformation of monotheism in various global contexts. For example, the Roman Empire in the 4th century, early modern England, early modern Japan, 1st century Israel. And so I've been thinking for many years about this category of monotheism and about the comparative study of religion in general. And it was in my studies of Japanese religions, including early modern Japanese Christianity, that I started to detect what I perceived were deficiencies regarding how monotheism was being treated in these contexts, both in the primary sources themselves, in terms of how various religions or members of religions were receiving and applying monotheism, but also in the secondary literature, both by Western and Japanese scholars. I took these sources to ultimately be making problematic judgments about monotheism, and especially about monotheism in Japan. I kept reading over and over that there is no monotheism in Japanese religions, or especially that there is no monotheism in pre modern Japanese religions. I found that, according to most scholars, monotheism is something only intruding into Japan from the outside. It's something that is held to be Western rather than Japanese. So, whatever Japanese religion is, it's not going to be monotheism. There's a built-in assumption there. So I was seeing these essentialized portraits of religions, which I thought were troublesome and also problematic definitions of monotheism, which was really making it very hard, I believed, and as I argue in the book, to even recognize monotheism, even though it's there staring us in the face. And at the same time, as I was going through all of this, I was encountering issues in the study of religions more broadly, and some popular opinions about categorization, which I came to disagree with. And this was also a motivating factor for me in writing this book. There's been quite a lot of discussion in religious studies over the past several decades about our categories. Um, Discussions taking place especially in so-called post-colonial studies and in what is described as the critical study of religions. This is an approach which more or less often advocates that we should either be very careful with Western terminology, but often that Western terminology shouldn't be imposed on non-Western cultural contexts. So I wanted to address all of this as well. Um, Both the rehabilitation of monotheism as a cross-cultural concept, as well as the specific problem of the application of monotheism to Japanese religions. So, as I continued my research in Japan, I became fascinated with what are called the Shinshukyo, as we just described. Um, Especially the earliest of these religions, Kurozumikyō, Tenrikyō, and Konkōkyō, and also Nyorai-kyo, which I do have several sections on in the book, but I don't focus as much as the others. I saw these groups as the best entry point for this broader discussion about monotheism in Japan. Since, as you saw in the book's description, there have been a few scholars who have broached the question of monotheism in these movements, and a few of them have said, yes, there is monotheism here. Though, like I said, the majority have disagreed and have offered an almost bewildering range of other categories and explanations to describe these groups. But I nevertheless saw this minority view, this positive affirmation of monotheism in a few of these movements. I saw this as our open door. Now, you might be wondering, why do we need an open door? Why not just start talking about monotheism or monotheism in pre-modern Japanese religions? Excuse me. Well, if you're not familiar with the field, again, like I said earlier, it's quite controversial to suggest that any Japanese religion is monotheistic. And as you'll see in this book, there are not only scholarly reasons for this, but sociocultural, sociopolitical motivations for keeping the category of monotheism out of Japan. And that's probably a topic in and of itself that I'll make future episodes on. But I was looking at all of this, and I saw that as a Western scholar, I would do well to have a proper entry point into this complex and confusing family of problems. And so I found pre-existing Western scholarship, the long, confusing history of Western scholarship on this question, of monotheism in the early Shinshikyo, I thought this fit the bill. Now, during this process of studying the Shinshikyo, I have become deeply fascinated with each of these movements in their own right. Again, Kurozumikyō, Tenrikyō, and Konkōkyō. I found them so very interesting and also insightful. And I've made lots of friends, and I've met many of the leaders of these groups and also scholars within these groups and other members over the last several years. Some of them have been very kind to host me in Japan and to share in their beautiful histories and teachings and to share all their traditions with me. It's really been a wonderful experience and one which I see has shaped me in many ways, both as a scholar and as a human being. And maybe I'll get into that another time. But speaking of my debts, I really owe a lot, not just to the members of these religions that I've been studying, but to the many people and groups who have supported my education and this book project in particular, including the many scholars who have reviewed this book, both during its life as a dissertation and also now as a book for Routledge. And I want to say that I've been especially grateful for my doctoral supervisor, Professor Elisabetta Porcu, who I actually continue to work with in the Department for the Study of Religions at UCT. For many of you, Professor Porcu probably needs no introduction, but if you'd like to look at her work, she is the author of the terrific book, Pure Land Buddhism in Modern Japanese Culture from Brill, which is the very first work of hers that I ever read. She also recently co-edited the volume Matsuri and Religion, and she's the author of many articles on Japan's NRMs and other topics, and is perhaps most famous for being the founding editor of Brill's Journal of Religion in Japan, which is absolutely fantastic and a highly recommended publication. Excuse me. Again, thank you to Professor Porcu for all of her invaluable support along this journey. So back to the book itself. Here are a few key features, you could say, of this book. It is the very first book-length study of monotheism in Japanese religions. I think that's pretty special. Currently, I don't think there is any direct competition for this volume on the market at all. So if nothing else, it is at least unique. Maybe in the end, you'll disagree with my arguments, but you'll at least have to agree that it is something different. The book also aims to resolve, as I said, a nearly century-long scholarly impasse regarding the classification of Japan's early NRMs. And of course, I think it does resolve it, but that will be for you to decide. The book also offers, as I mentioned, a new framework for better understanding monotheism, as well as monotheistic subcategories, for which I also include a variety of illustrations that I hope you'll find useful. So quite a lot going on here with this book. I do think you'll get your money's worth. The bibliography alone, on my Word manuscript, it's over 40 pages of references. We'll see what it comes out to in actual book pages. But I think it's around 700 or 800 different sources cited in the bibliography. That's primary and secondary sources, Western and Japanese. So I think it's rather robust and full of information, and I hope ultimately it will be useful for readers in that way as well. And speaking of readers, in terms of its intended audience, it's written for researchers interested in religious studies and philosophy of religion, and also I think students of theology will find it interesting. Obviously, scholars of Asian religions should find it worth their time, but also perhaps scholars working in Japanese area studies as well. And it might also make for some helpful supplementary reading in some graduate religious studies or philosophy of religion courses, due to its sections on the nature and the category of monotheism. Though probably, I think it'll be too technical for undergraduate courses. That's just my suspicion. You may have some really great undergraduate students. But I do want to take a moment to emphasize that I do really think that this book, even though it is clearly about Japanese religions, it should ultimately have even broader appeal outside of East Asian religious studies. And this is because of not only its handling of the category of monotheism, but also because of its discussions of Orientalism and post-colonialism, as well as other issues in the cross-cultural and comparative study of religion. Again, to be quite clear, it is definitely a focused study on issues related to these three Japanese NRMs. But the book should definitely also be seen as part of the broader conversation that is happening in religious studies about the categories we use to talk about religions. So even if you're not an expert in Japanese religions, that's okay. It's actually written with non-specialists in Japanese religions in mind, since I'm aiming to generate broader conversation about the category of monotheism and also about the cross-cultural study of religion. So I think there'll be something here for many of you, even if you're just interested in monotheism, even from a theological perspective, or even from an East-West cultural exchange perspective. I think there's definitely going to be a lot to think about, and hopefully you'll find some things that are helpful to you along the way. And here's a look at the table of contents. It has 9 chapters, that's including the intro and the conclusion. And I'll keep this table of contents on the screen as I start from the beginning of the book and give you a little more detailed view of the book's contents and of the progression of its arguments. And so, again, the first thing that I want to point out is that this is a very difficult subject. Classifying Japan's early new religious movements has generated significant disagreement, and I think real confusion in Western scholarship. This is a very difficult topic, and the result of this difficulty has been a range of voices over the last century who have alternatively looked at these new religious movements and have described them as polytheism, or sometimes they've called them pantheisms or panentheisms, or henotheisms. Yes, and also sometimes monotheisms. Um, but some scholars have even tried to straddle multiple categories at the same time, and some have also said we shouldn't categorize these religions at all. It's just not possible to do, or we shouldn't try to do it. So the result of all of this, I suggest, has been a reinforcement of a widespread assumption that most scholars have had about the incompatibility between monotheism and Japanese religions in general. So, with this book, I take an integrative philosophy of religion and religious studies approach, perhaps what some have called the philosophy of religious studies. And I'm humbly aiming to resolve this classificatory stalemate, and at the same time, to inspire new discussion about the relationship between monotheism and Japanese religions in general. So, beginning with the table of contents here, um, the book begins with chapter 1, the introduction, arguing that the long history of Western dissonance over NRM classification is actually the result of a complex layering of taxonomical, sociocultural, and scholarly issues. These issues include, first of all, two narrow definitions of monotheism: nationalistic public discourse in Japan, the scholarly avoidance of Western terminology and concepts in the study of religion, the prevalence of essentializing East-West dichotomies in the study of religion, and also scholarly assumptions about devotional practices. I argue that all of these have coalesced to make monotheism ultimately very hard to see in Japanese religions, even if it's staring us in the face. So, after in chapter 1, I claim that there is this widespread scholarly confusion. In chapter 2, the book then justifies this claim by surveying the taxonomical rulings of the past century of Western scholarship regarding Kurozumikyō, Tenrikyō, and Konkōkyō. And I also talk about Nyorai-kyō as well. And all of this reveals what I see as this history of confusion and disagreement in Western studies and also in Japanese studies, and therefore also a need for a new taxonomy. And so excuse me, this second chapter serves to introduce readers to this history of scholarship, but at the same time, it also is introducing them to the history and the theological atmosphere of these three movements: Kurozumikyō, Tenrikyō, Konkōkyō. And so I find this chapter actually pretty dynamic, although it is surveying a lot of past voices. It's clearly here to establish the problem in past scholarship. But I also think it's quite going to be quite interesting. Then in chapter 3, after introducing this problematic situation, the book then works to justify its taxonomical agenda and its methodology by engaging with this contemporary aversion in religious studies to applying perceptibly Western categories, or any categories at all, to Japanese traditions. And I argue here that classification is, in fact, an operation which is basic to the study of religions. And I make an argument for the integrative use of philosophy of religion in order to more accurately represent these religious teachings. So, analyzing religious doctrines not as a means of determining whether religious propositions are true or false, but rather as a means of improving our understanding, improving our reception of religions by getting a better view of what it is that they're really up to. So, after this, from this point in chapter 4, we then move to rehabilitate monotheism. The book tries to provide an updated definition of monotheism that takes into account its nuances. And also, as I mentioned, it presents several monotheistic subcategories, and also engages popular categories like henotheism, pantheism, panentheism. And as I said, it includes a lot of, I hope, helpful diagrams that I've drawn that should help you understand these different species of monotheism that I have in view. So from this point, once we are once we are armed with this updated taxonomical rubric, the book then turns in chapter 5 to revisiting the teachings of Kurozumikyō, Tenrikyō, and Konkōkyō. And we finally reveal the real presence of monotheism and of several varieties of monotheism in these Japanese NRMs. And so in this way, I see that the book is contributing not only to the study of these particular Japanese religions, but also to the study of monotheism and to the ongoing theoretical discussions in the study of religion, which are critiquing our comparative categories. And the truth is, I'll mention this here, the truth is that you might see this book as actually two books in one. I did have one reviewer make this observation, that this first half that I've talked about is more methodological and theoretical. It is justifying a certain methodology and then rehabilitating this particular category of monotheism as effective for cross-cultural study. But then the second half is clearly more historical. It is aiming to contribute to certain long-standing historical issues in the study of Japanese NRMs using this new taxonomical rubric. Excuse me. Most scholars up to this point have assumed that pre-modern Japanese religions are all polytheistic, or maybe they're varieties of atheism or animism. And so in this paradigm, pre-modern Japanese religions didn't offer the NRM founders any monotheism to work with. So if you belong to, if you're one of the few scholars who have detected monotheism in the NRMs, then, and if you assume that pre-modern Japanese religions offered no monotheism, then you're going to ask, well, where did this monotheism come from? And so what I do from this point in the book is I consider how among those few scholars who have recognized monotheism in the NRM, they have turned to a thesis about NRM founders having contact with Christians of some variety. Especially, it is proposed that the NRM founders, they must have had contact with the Kakure Christian, or the hidden Christians of Japan. So I argue that when they do this, this is a way of saying, okay, well, there might have been monotheism here, just here in these NRMs, but it's not Japanese. Okay, it's not. It's a foreign intrusion. Monotheism is something Western. It's something Christian. Monotheism is an intrusion from outside into the Japanese landscape. So, against all of this, the book conducts a new historical investigation in light of this new taxonomy, including a rather unprecedented study of Kakure Christian doctrine, and as well as the doctrine of other historical Japanese movements, including medieval Shinto, Kokugaku or national study movements, Japanese Neo-Confucian traditions, and several others as well. And this historical investigation, I argue, reveals several more plausible Japanese sources of monotheism, several non-Christian Japanese sources of monotheism that would have lent themselves to the NRM founders in the history of Japanese religion. So I suggest that all of the findings of this study, recognizing that, first of all, yes, there is in fact monotheism in Japan's NRMs, and then recognizing additionally that that this monotheism did not come from Western Christian sources, but rather came from earlier Japanese sources. I suggest that all of this indicates a need for a reformation of the image of monotheism in studies of Japan, and that it furthermore reveals, I think, that there's been a subtle persistence of a subterranean orientalizing tendency among some segments of Western scholarship, some segments which have proposed that Western categories shouldn't be imposed on non-Western cultures. And so in this way also, I see that the book tries to contribute to the theoretical and methodological debates in religious studies, in addition to the debates in religious studies and then in the intellectual history of Japan and in the study of monotheism in general. So I know that's a lot, but I do think this book will be quite interesting and probably surprising to many scholars working in these fields, and again, probably controversial as well. But I'm very much looking forward to the feedback, all of which has been extremely positive so far from the scholars who have reviewed this work already. But I am expecting to see some lively debates. Okay, so hopefully that was enough to pique your interest. Like I said, the book should be coming out this year in 2025. According to Routledge, you can pre-order it starting June 13th, 2025, and it should ship after July 4th, 2025. And it will, of course, be appearing, first of all, in a hardback and then a paperback later. And I'll be making some announcements about all of this as we go, but you can also be on the lookout via the Routledge website. And I'd really love if you pre-ordered or picked up a copy, or if you had your university library or your department pick one up for you, since it will be in hardcover first. And you can be sure that the ideas presented in this book will also be a topic of study on this channel. We'll be talking about Kurozumikyō, Tenrikyō, and Konkōkyō, and other of the Japanese religious movements we've talked about. We'll be talking about the study of monotheism in general. All of this research will have provided quite a lot of ammunition for this channel going forward. And I'm looking forward to the discussions that we're going to have about the book. If you are interested in this, or if you have thoughts on the idea of monotheism in Japanese religions already, and you want to start that conversation now, please feel free to go ahead and do so in the comments, or send me an email. Really looking forward to your thoughts and going on this journey into monotheism in Japan. But until then, I'm Kegan Chandler. Thanks so much for joining me. If you enjoyed this content or the rest of the content on this channel, please do like and subscribe, share the videos. All of it really helps the channel out. So again, thanks so much. We'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.